Thorpe Park for many people is known as the thrill capital of the UK, but it hasn't always been that way. In this series I'm going to go through all the history of the park, including some old maps, old attractions, old adverts, strange marketing decisions, celebrities that visit the park, and so much more. If you've seen my Alton Towers videos, you know exactly what to expect. In this video, we're going to start off with the 80s. Now before I actually get into the park itself, it's probably worth just a little brief bit of an intro into how the park came to be. Now the area itself has been there for quite some time, and it used to be owned by RMC. Now, not the RMC you think about as an enthusiast, RMC as in ready mixed concrete. And for many years this was just a giant gravel pit. They eventually, when they'd kind of used up all the land, they filled it in with water. In 1975 it was used for the Water Ski World Championships. Now fast forward a couple more years, and 1979 the park as we know it became a thing. Now it was opened by Lord Louis Mountbatten. This was his last public appearance because he was not long after that assassinated. But the park in 79 was very different to what you and I think of Thorpe Park today. Just one thing to touch on, the park opened on the 24th of May. Some of you may recognise that date because, well, at the time recorded just over a week or two ago, Hyperia launched on exactly the same day to celebrate the park's 45th birthday. Now, some of those early attractions, as I said already, were a million miles away from what we'd expect today. There was an aircraft display, which you would probably guess displayed a bunch of aircrafts. There was Model World, which actually stuck around for quite some time. Kind of similar-ish to Legoland Model World, except obviously not made from Lego. There was an Invaders of Britain display, and the history of man. Now moving on to 1980, the early years of the park were a little bit slow, to be honest. The only thing that came in 1980 was the water bus. Now this used to take guests around the lake. Eventually it was extended when the farm came along, but in its early days it would just kind of do a round of the lake. Now there was two different boats. One of them was named Lady Amherst and the other one was Lady Caroline. Now, these were specially designed boats. They had heating, they had air conditioning, which, you know, even today we still don't really have a lot of that in the UK. They had anti-glare glass and they also had onboard toilets. Moving on to 1981, the park introduced Cinema 180, which at the time was the first in the UK. It was effectively, as the name suggests, a cinema with a screen that was 180 degrees around you, which for the time was considered to be immersive. Probably by today's standards it definitely wouldn't be. There was a number of videos that they showed on there, one of which was a POV of a coaster, which is kind of ironic because at that point they didn't have any coasters, so the closest you were going to get to going on a roller coaster in Thorpe Park was basically standing in a cinema and seeing one going around you. Now you would think a cinema is a ridiculously simple thing, right? I mean, even back then when it was film based, I mean nowadays obviously it's all digital, it's super simple, but back then when it was film you would think, oh, you just take the film, wind it through a few cogs, ta-da! Apparently it was an absolute nightmare to operate. It was super complicated, and if you screwed up that film when you were loading it, it had to be shipped off to America and the attraction was offline for weeks on end. So something fairly straightforward was actually ridiculously complicated. So moving on to 1982, and I sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier, fairly big expansion for the park. This is the year that Thorpe Farm came onto site. This was a traditional working farm, so you saw the machinery you would expect to see in a farm, and they had a ridiculous selection of animals over the years, including sheep, cows, pigs, goats, chickens, turkeys, ducks, horses, donkeys, Shetland ponies, guinea pigs, and llamas. Throughout the lifetime of the farm, there was a number of different additions. There was the craft centre, there was a gift shop, there was ice cream, there was a restaurant called Potbellies, interesting name, and there was a children's playground. Now in 1982 we also saw the addition of a number of small kids attractions. There was a bouncy castle, there was ladybugs, a dolphin ride, carousel, and Dizzy Den, which was an indoor soft play. Now in 83, this is when we started to see things pick up a little bit. This was the year that the park introduced a pay one price. So at that point, you had single entry, which is kind of familiar with what we have today, and you could get on all the different attractions. In addition to that, we also saw 4 new attractions added, one of which was the Magic Mill. Now this is a slow kind of boat ride around towards the farm, I believe. We also saw Phantom Fantasia. Now this was an indoor haunted house dark ride attraction. Looks fantastic, certainly for the age. Interestingly, the pictures I've seen make it look like the cars are very similar to the Doom buggies in Disney. I don't think it was an Omnimover system, but visually very, very similar. Another thing that we got in 83 was the Treasure Island Railway. Now this was sort of a smaller train and it was kind of pantomime-esque. So they were talking about the curse and the black spot, and anytime they mentioned it, you were meant to go, "Oh no, the black spot!" The way they did this was they would pick one of the guests on each journey, typically a young child, and give them a little card. And if you got that card, you got the black spot. It wasn't cursed, because if you got the black spot, you got a free ice cream or a free can of Coke. Now another water-based attraction-ish that turned up was the Thorpe Bell. Now this was docked and moved around the park a little bit over the years, but it had various different guises. So it started off as the Thorpe Bell, it became China Diner, it was then used for some private hire, it was an education centre, and then finally it was used for the Saw Alive experience. Now, over the years it started to kind of capsize and wasn't particularly stable, so, well, many of you know, it's no longer there. So I said earlier that when Cinema 180 came out, it was the only way to experience a coaster. Now in 1984, we finally got a coaster. Now it was only a powered coaster, it was indoors, and if you look at the images from this, you know, it had over-the-shoulder restraints, so naturally you think, well, that must have been quite an intense ride. It's still there today, and we know it as the Flying Fish. So no, it definitely was not intense. I have no idea why on earth it had over-the-shoulder restraints, but yeah, started off as Space Station Zero. It moved outside a few years later as the Flying Fish with green trains, and then obviously it still exists today. It's been moved again, but now it has the orange trains. Now in 84, we also started to get Thorpe Park on TV. Not as Thorpe Park though. It was used as the set for quite a few Benny Hill sketches. In this video, please do consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing. And I'd love to hear your memories from this decade. If you visited the park in the 80s, please do share some comments below. I really hope that this series kind of triggers some nostalgia for many of you, so I'd love to hear your stories. Now a much loved attraction was added in 1985, and that is Cap and Andy Review. Now this was an animatronic show where there was a number of different animals. We had Cap and Andy playing a banjo, who was a dog and the town's fire chief. There was also a hippo, hillbilly hounds, a seagull, 2 frogs and 3 cats. Now this attraction wasn't actually built for Thorpe Park. It actually was used in America in a restaurant chain, and when that chain closed down, well, the animatronics became available and Thorpe Park took them. So it wasn't original to them. It was no doubt tweaked a little bit to fit the park. It left the park, and as far as I can tell, it does still exist. I've seen footage of it in another location. It is currently in, as far as I can tell, Watermouth Castle. Oh, and interestingly, some Disney Imagineers were actually involved in the creation of these animatronics. Clearly not for Thorpe Park, as I said initially. But there you go, it was kind of almost a little piece of Disney inside Thorpe Park. Another attraction that I can't get an exact date for, all I can see is mid-80s, so I'm gonna assume 85, it was Bronco bikes. Now, these weren't unique to Thorpe Park, and I don't think they really exist nowadays. So certainly I hadn't seen them, and maybe I'm just the odd one out. These looked on the face of it like standard push bikes, but the axes on both the front and the rear wheel were off-center, which kind of lent to this kind of odd sort of motion as you cycled the bikes along. 1986 was another relatively quiet year. All we got were the teacups. Now these are still there today. They've changed name and slightly been rebranded and re-sponsored over the years. So we've had them as the teacups. We had Storm and the Teacup. We've now got Double Tea Party. Was there another version? I think that's the only versions we had. '87 was should have been a really good year for the park, but it was also a year with a little bit of bad news and disaster for the park. So in '87, the Rapids ride was opened. Now, it was opened by Dennis Thatcher, so Maggie's husband, generally to a lot of fanfare. Now the ride still exists today. It's kind of gone from Thunder River to Ribena Rumba Rapids to just Rumba Rapids. Unfortunately, in that opening year, there was an incident where a boat got stuck, flipped over, and a young boy, his ear was severed off. So yeah, not really the best for the park. And you know, in an interview, the mum wanted the ride shut down completely.
There was nobody from Thorpe Park there, just nobody.
The Palladium Theatre was added in 1988. Now this was a 630 seat theatre, and it was opened by Hollywood music star Howard Keel. Now it had various shows over the years, including a space-themed variety show, Legend of the Ring, which is kind of like an Indiana Jones style ride, Merlin's Magic Castle, which was a medieval musical, and now that is the site of the 4D cinema. Now if you've seen the Alton Towers series, and I kind of alluded to this at the start of the video, wherever I can I try and dig out old footage. This is the first advert I could find from the park, 1988.
Where can we take Dad for his birthday?
I know.
Thorpe Park, just off junction 11 or 13 on the M25.
Did you enjoy that, Dad?
Great.
It's your birthday next week, Dad.
You'll have to come back next week then.
Ring 01 200 0200 for opening details.
Now we round out the decade on quite a high, because in 1989 we got a number of attractions that were well loved and stayed in the park for some time. The first one, of course, is Logger's Leap. Now this was the UK's tallest log flume and had a rather impressive double down element. Now Logger's Leap was a Mack log flume. Interestingly, the ride that has since replaced it is another Mack ride in the form of Hyperia. Now when it was opened by Timmy Mallet and Michaela Strachan. It's well known later on in a few years' time that Princess Di and the boys were on this ride. There's tons of footage of them. Interestingly, if you've watched Jack Silkstone's construction updates for Hyperia, which now sits in that same site, there is still a portion of Logger's Leap that exists. There's a small section of the trough that they did not remove, so that bit of history still remains in the park to this day.
And if we just poke our head through this little gap in the fence, you can see from this angle that we have in fact still got Logger's Leaps out there.
And 1989 also saw the introduction of the Thorpe Park Rangers. Now these guys stuck around for many years. They stayed until 2005. Now there was quite a few Rangers over the years. They kind of expanded a few years down the line. Now the Rangers included, we had Chief Ranger, we had Baby Bear, we had Mr. Monkey, Mr. Elephant, Mr. Giraffe, Mr. Rabbit, and then later on we got Miss Hippo, Miss Frog, and Harley. The next one is a kind of much loved kids ride that many hoped the park would save when they got rid of Old Town, but unfortunately they did not, and that was the Rocky Express. Now, on the face of it, this just looks like a simple kids ride with some trains that kind of run around, but from what I've heard, it was reasonably intense for a ride of its type. The final addition we got in this decade was the Canada Creek Railway, which many of you will know was the railway that kind of ran throughout the park from the farm to the rest of the park. And again, sadly, that was removed, hasn't operated for many years, and now is completely gone. And I have our second advert.
When you meet the Thorpe Park Rangers, it's a fortnight's all-in-one. Up the M25 at junction 11 or 13.
There you go, guys, that is the first in the series. That is the 80s, and a little bit the 70s in there. So make sure that you subscribe to see the rest of the series, which will be dropping over the next couple of weeks. There will be one for the 90s, the noughties, the 10s, and of course the 20s. If you've enjoyed this one, make sure you hit that like button. I've been Chris, you've been watching Coaster Dad, and I shall see you in the next one. Adios!